Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Mr. M.K. Narayanan, who has served India as its national security advisor, and he is also a former director of the Intelligence Bureau and as well as a former chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. He has even served as the former governor of West Bengal. So, based on his considerable experience in the Intelligence Bureau, he evaluates India's direct role in the liberation of Bangladesh and how India helped out the Bengali minorities of East Pakistan to escape the atrocities that were being committed against them by the government in West Pakistan. See, in East Pakistan, the Bengali minorities were being discriminated and targeted by the government in West Pakistan. This discrimination and oppression kept increasing through the 1960s and eventually gave birth to a Bangla national movement led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Following this rise in political and nationalistic activity, the Pakistani army launched Operation Searchlight in 1971 with the intention of targeting the Bengali nationalists. Under this military campaign, the Pakistani army unleashed massive violence against the Bengali minorities and the Bengali leaders, which resulted in one of the gravest humanitarian crises that the South Asia region had witnessed. Following this major escalation in violence, around 5 million refugees flowed over into India, and the neighboring states such as Assam, West Bengal, and the others, they had to open up their borders to a flood of refugees who were coming in from East Pakistan. So this not only placed enormous strain on India, but this humanitarian crisis also made it a moral obligation for India to rush to the defense of the Bengali minorities and to enable them in their fight against West Pakistan. At this crucial juncture, India displayed splendid political leadership with the coordinated functioning of its civilian administration, diplomacy, military, and intelligence agencies, which enabled India to register one of its finest victories in the domain of foreign policy and national security. The then Indian government, headed by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, played a direct role in enabling the liberation of Bangladesh from West Pakistan and in the birth of a new country. In this column, the writer goes on to mark the spectacular contribution of the different arms of the Indian government under the astute political leadership of the then government, which not only helped India register one of its finest victories, but it also helped India enable a much larger purpose, that was to liberate Bangladesh from the stranglehold of West Pakistan and transform the destiny of the Bengali minorities, as a result of which Bangladesh today stands as a success story in South Asia. As the refugee crisis escalated along the borders, the civilian administration of both the center and the state governments, they stepped up to the role, and they not only successfully accommodated the refugees in refugee camps, but they even managed in delivering essential relief to the incoming refugees. For a poor country like India, it was no easy task to provide relief to nearly 5 million refugees, and the Indian government along with the state governments, they did a splendid job thanks to the all-round efforts of the civilian bureaucracy. Then this was also the finest hour for Indian diplomacy, because Indian diplomats around the world, they carried the message of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to global capitals to resist the global pressure that was coming against India, particularly from the Western countries, as they were largely aligned with Pakistan. Please remember that this was the era of the Cold War, and as a result of the Cold War era mindset and Cold War era military alliances, Pakistan was considered to be a key ally of the Western countries, especially for the United States. So as India stepped up its involvement in the liberation of Bangladesh, the US brought tremendous pressure on India, and it even went to the extent of threatening the Indira Gandhi government with war by pushing the US 7th Naval Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, which even consisted of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Despite this open hostility shown by the US against India, the Indira Gandhi government held on to its resolve of helping out Bangladesh, and Indian diplomats around the world not only successfully resisted American pressure, but they even went on to build a counter-narrative against Pakistan's atrocities at the United Nations and as well as across global capitals. The Prime Minister herself played a direct role in convincing global leaders of several nations of the kind of atrocities that Pakistan was committing in East Pakistan. When the then US President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger displayed open hostility towards India and Indira Gandhi, the Indian government resisted the pressure, and even when American naval forces were pushed into the Bay of Bengal to threaten India, India firmly held on to its ground, and it went on to achieve a diplomatic landmark by abandoning the non-aligned principle and by firmly siding with the Soviet Union by signing the landmark India-Soviet Union Treaty of Peace and Friendship. This treaty guaranteed India the Soviet support if it were to be attacked by the United States, and this Soviet guarantee pushed back the American advances. Parallelly, the Indian military as well, that is the Indian Armed Forces, also registered their finest victory as a result of the far-sighted leadership of both the military class and the political class. When the crisis erupted in the month of March, there was tremendous pressure from the Indian public on the Indian government to retaliate against Pakistan and to punish Pakistan for the atrocities that it was committing against the Bengali minorities. But instead of jumping towards a premature intervention in East Pakistan, the Indian government and the Indian Armed Forces resisted the public pressure and they put on hold a complete overt war with Pakistan for a few months until the Indian Armed Forces were well prepared. And in fact, India didn't mount any attacks against Pakistan until December 1971. This policy of restraint worked in India's favor, both strategically and tactically. And in fact, it was Pakistan which first attacked India on the 3rd of December 1971, thereby marking the beginning of the overt phase of the war. Once the conflict began, within a span of 2 weeks, Indian Armed Forces registered a conclusive victory against Pakistan through complete domination in all the domains of conflict, where the Indian Army, the Indian Navy, and the Indian Air Force emerged victorious through their historic conquests. And this success of the Indian Armed Forces is something that has been very well documented. I'm sure most of us would have read about these accounts or at least heard about them. And even to this day, the armed forces also commemorate several of their conquests against Pakistan in this conflict. At the end of the war, the Pakistani armed forces officially surrendered, and they even went on to sign the Instrument of Surrender, which marked the fall of Dhaka, thereby signaling the defeat of West Pakistan. At the end of this conflict, India held on to around 95,000 POWs or prisoners of war, and this was without a doubt one of the finest victories for all the three branches of the Indian Armed Forces. While the incredible role of these arms of the government is acknowledged and recognized, the role of Indian intelligence agencies is hardly spoken about, and to this day, the daring covert operations of Indian intelligence agencies, which enabled the liberation of Bangladesh, is not officially acknowledged. Because that is the very nature of covert warfare, and intelligence agencies are bound to function away from limelight. But 50 years later, the writer says that the time has come to acknowledge the role of Indian intelligence agencies in liberating Bangladesh. Because even before India fought this overt war of 1971, several months earlier, India had already initiated a covert war targeted against Pakistan, and this secret war of India would play a pivotal role in the liberation of Bangladesh. As the political situation was deteriorating in Bangladesh by 1970, the then Indira Gandhi government had authorized RAW, or Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's external intelligence agency, to directly step into this emerging conflict and launch a covert war against Pakistan. The Intelligence Bureau, which is India's domestic intelligence agency now, was handling both domestic and foreign intelligence prior to 1968. In 1968, foreign intelligence was bifurcated from IB, and RAW was set up to exclusively handle external intelligence. So when IB was handling both domestic and foreign intelligence before 1968, it had carefully cultivated a large number of intelligence agents who were working in East Pakistan, and later the RAW, which was formed in 1968, would build on these assets and develop a strong and widespread network of covert agents who would back India's bid in this conflict by directly supporting the Bengali nationalists. Throughout this period of conflict, RAW was not just involved in collection of valuable intelligence, but it was also running covert operations targeted at sabotaging the Pakistani army in order to weaken its position and control over East Pakistan. As the crisis began after Operation Searchlight, and as millions of refugees flowed into India, RAW set up training camps along the border, and through its SFF, the Special Frontier Force, which is a highly secretive covert special force of RAW, India started providing training to the Bengali liberation fighters and brought them together under a grouping known as Mukti Bahini. And this army of Bangladeshi irregulars were sponsored and supported by India with constant supply of weapons, funds, and training. The Mukti Bahini rebels would be infiltrated back into East Pakistan with the support of RAW and SFF, and they would go on to target the Pakistani armed forces in order to sabotage their positions in East Pakistan. And even before the actual war began in December 1971, India had already considerably weakened the Pakistani armed forces stationed in East Pakistan. Then, even after the conflict began in December 1971, IB and RAW would play a stellar role in backing the Indian armed forces. And this historic success of our intelligence agencies has not been well documented or recognized because the government doesn't acknowledge these covert operations even to this day as a result of secrecy surrounding these operations. On the occasion of the Golden Jubilee of Liberation of Bangladesh, the writer recommends that the time has come for the Indian government to acknowledge the role of Indian intelligence agents and the stellar role played by IB and RAW in liberating Bangladesh. The biggest compliment for India from this conflict stems from the fact that today Bangladesh has emerged as a success story in South Asia. And despite long periods of political instability and rising radicalism and fundamentalism, Bangladesh has remained as a stable country with a strong commitment to secularism and women's rights. Today, the Awami League, which is in power, has successfully led Bangladesh, and under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who is the daughter of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, Bangladesh has successfully transitioned from being a least developed country into a developing nation. Until 2026, Bangladesh will be in the process of this transition, and if it manages to hold on to its development indicators, it will officially be recognized as a developing country. Today, Bangladesh has performed phenomenally well in various areas of economic growth and socio-economic welfare, and it is very important to note that Bangladesh has even outperformed India in several HDI indicators. Today, the Bangladeshi economy has matured and has emerged as one of India's key trading partners in South Asia. And the most heartening fact is that today Bangladesh GDP has even overtaken the GDP of its parent country, that is Pakistan. So it is this success story of Bangladesh that serves as the best accolade for India, which happens to be the best compliment for marking its finest victory in foreign policy and national security. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial that evaluates the India-US Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership that was recently signed between India and the United States during the Leaders Summit on Climate. US President Joe Biden hosted a Leaders Summit on Climate involving 40 leaders of major economies and vulnerable nations. And during this interaction, India-US have signed a key climate agreement that will allow two of the largest emitters to cooperate with each other and step up climate funding and sharing of clean technology with India. See, currently, if you look at the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, China ranks the top position, followed by the United States, and India ranks at the third position. But despite being one of the largest polluters in the world, India's per capita emissions still happens to be one of the lowest in the world, and our per capita emissions are less than 60% of the global average. So that clearly shows that while India should remain firmly committed to climate action and to combating climate change and global warming, it need not be forced by developed countries and large emitters like China to take up matching targets because India's per capita emissions still happens to be one of the lowest in the world. See, this decade leading up to 2030 is said to be a decisive decade with regard to climate change and climate action. And if we are to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement targets, then every country will have to contribute to these efforts. But however, these need not be equal efforts. Because when it comes to climate action, the core principle is CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle highlights the everlasting conflict between developed nations and developing nations on the subject of climate change and global warming. See, for decades, developed nations, particularly Western countries like US and European countries, they consumed most of the carbon space that was available by burning fossil fuels in very large quantities, which allowed them to develop their countries. But developing nations like India and small and weak and vulnerable nations, they never got the opportunity to utilize their carbon budget. And hence today, the larger responsibility of working towards climate action falls on the developed nations. But that being said, it doesn't mean that developing nations do not have any responsibility. Their focus should be on adoption of renewable power, decarbonizing their economy, and adoption of cleaner technologies. But investments in these technologies are very expensive, and for many countries, these technologies are simply not affordable. Even to carry out any innovation or research and development in these areas, it requires enormous funding, something that the developing nations and underdeveloped nations are not capable of. This is where the principle of CBDR acquires importance. According to this principle, fighting climate change is a common responsibility for every country, but the responsibilities need not be the same. Instead, they can be differentiated based on the country's historical responsibilities. So today it's much more easier for the developed nations to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels as they have already achieved their development targets. But the same can't be expected out of developing nations and underdeveloped countries, and hence the developed countries have an obligation to provide for finance and technology which will help the developing nations and the underdeveloped countries to transition towards cleaner economies. But this transition of the world towards cleaner economy is currently under threat by the COVID-19 pandemic. The International Energy Agency has estimated that following the economic crash caused by the pandemic, countries around the world are going to rush to promote growth and revive economic activity and create jobs in their economies, which would result in the return of countries towards fossil fuels, quite similar to what was witnessed following the 2008 financial crisis. See, under the Paris Agreement of the Climate Change Convention, countries were obligated to keep the global rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius and if possible under 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century as compared to pre-industrial levels. Most countries were working towards this target by announcing voluntary contributions known as NDCs or nationally determined contributions. But the pandemic has disrupted the efforts of countries around the world in implementing and achieving their NDC targets. And considering the grave economic situation created by the pandemic, many countries would be tempted to abandon their climate goals and rush back towards fossil fuels in order to revive growth. So to prevent this from happening, it's very important for developed nations like US to lead from the front and help out the smaller countries and the developing nations by providing them with the right kind of finance and technology. Now, this is where the importance of the India-US Climate Pact comes into picture because it promises US assistance to India in transitioning the Indian economy towards greater adoption of renewable forms of energy in order to decarbonize various sectors of India's economy, including transportation, building and construction, energy and power, and as well as infrastructure. This climate pact will help India access cleaner technologies and materials from the US. And along with the option of enhanced funding from the US, India can strive towards achieving its climate targets. This climate pact has great potential to promote sustainable development in a post-pandemic era, and it could even set an example for other countries to follow the same lead. And developed countries such as US, UK, and other European nations could help out many other smaller nations by living up to their promise of arranging $100 billion in climate finance. On their part as well, US and UK have already announced many major initiatives during the Leaders Summit on Climate. And if Britain has announced a cut in emissions by 78% by 2035, the US has announced a cut in its emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. Eventually, these countries would be moving towards net zero emissions or carbon neutrality, and they would even expect India, which is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, to strive towards net zero emissions. But considering India's low per capita emissions and India's lack of any historical responsibility, India should continue defending its carbon space and seek out more finance and technology from the West in order to further accelerate its transition towards cleaner technologies. Next, in a column on page number 7, the writers examine as to how the Indian judiciary can help the country in battling the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. See, one can't expect our High Courts and Supreme Court to strengthen our health infrastructure or to arrange for oxygen supplies or to implement the vaccination program because that is the jurisdiction and the domain of the executive, that is the government. While the judiciary cannot play such a direct role in helping the country battle the pandemic, it can play a crucial role as per its constitutional mandate in asking the right questions to the executive and in holding the executive accountable for its policy failure, which has clearly pushed the country into a deadly second wave of the pandemic. Back in 1989, in the Parmanand Katara case, the Supreme Court had observed that right to emergency medical treatment is a citizen's fundamental right. And in line with this ruling, and in order to enforce this fundamental right, multiple high courts across the country have taken up several COVID-19 related cases that are questioning the governments, that is, both central and state governments, over their policy failure. As several high courts are looking into these cases, the Supreme Court took suo motu cognizance of the devastating impact of the pandemic, and it has even suggested that it might invoke its powers under Article 139A of the Constitution, which allows the Supreme Court to club multiple cases going on at high courts and transfer all these cases to itself when these cases involve the same questions of law. But however, the writers point out, any such attempt by the Supreme Court to club these cases and transfer these cases to itself would be highly problematic and could probably result in the derailment of justice, and it might fail to hold the executive accountable for its policy mistakes. The writers are of this opinion because, according to them, of late the Indian judiciary has been very indifferent in its conduct, and over the last few years, several serious questions have been raised by experts over the inability of the Supreme Court to express any strong dissent over government decisions, even when they prima facie appear to be controversial and in contravention to the Constitution. In cases related to the ban on internet in Jammu and Kashmir, and in cases related to farmers' protests, and in several other cases of arbitrary detentions, the Supreme Court reportedly has failed to take a balanced stand, and in most of these critical cases, it has even failed to express any form of dissent against executive orders and decisions. And alarmingly, it has always sided with the government in upholding these decisions. This has even led to controversial questions over the integrity and the conduct of the Supreme Court itself. And the writers also fear that if the Supreme Court transfers these cases to itself, it might display the rising centralizing tendency within the Indian higher judiciary. This is where they make a call for promoting judicial federalism, much like federalism and decentralization is promoted in center-state relations. See, as per the 7th schedule of the Constitution, public health is listed as a state subject under the state list, and hence there is no doubt that states are primarily responsible for dealing with the pandemic. And the center is supposed to back them up and provide timely support and the right kind of intervention, because several issues related to the handling of the pandemic can even fall under the union list and the concurrent list. And there are even several interstate related issues that have come up, especially with regard to arranging uninterrupted oxygen supplies across state borders. So while these cases related to interstate conflicts and union and concurrent subjects might motivate the Supreme Court to take up all these cases at once, it should not forget the fact that high courts are the best suited to handle these cases individually. Because from the perspective of geography and basic logic, high courts are best placed to look into these individual cases, because in each region, the pandemic related challenges are different and the solutions that are being designed are also different. So instead of looking at this as a uniform problem and instead of striving towards a uniform solution, it would be better for the Supreme Court to decentralize these powers and rely upon judicial federalism to allow the high courts respectively to look into different region specific challenges and respectively hold the governments accountable for their failures. Then there is another strong argument that favors judicial federalism. In 1997, in the L. Chandrakumar case, the Supreme Court itself had recognized the glorious judicial tradition of the high courts and how they had functioned effectively since the 19th century. Keeping this observation in mind, the Supreme Court should not forget that under Article 226 of the Constitution, the High Courts have a much wider writ jurisdiction as compared to the Supreme Court's writ jurisdiction under Article 32, which is a much narrower writ jurisdiction. Because under Article 32, the Supreme Court can exercise its writ jurisdiction only with regard to enforcement of fundamental rights, whereas the High Courts can go beyond this and they can issue writs not only for enforcing fundamental rights but even with regard to other related matters. Considering the various challenges that has been created by the pandemic, it would be appropriate to allow the High Courts respectively to look at region-specific problems and to empower the High Courts to freely exercise their wider writ jurisdiction, which will truly help in holding the governments accountable for their policy failures. In fact, this argument for judicial federalism is even backed by the examples of legal systems around the world as well. Even if you look at countries such as United States, judicial federalism and decentralization in the judiciary is favored, and it is only in rare and exceptional cases where uniformity is required due to the same questions of law that are involved. Only in such cases does the Supreme Court seek to transfer the cases at the lower courts to itself. So the writers are of the opinion that the Supreme Court of India should follow the same precedent and look at its own rulings in previous cases. And instead of encroaching upon the jurisdiction of the high courts, it should allow judicial federalism to flourish, especially with regard to COVID-19 cases, as it's crucial to hold our governments accountable for their policy mistakes. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: evaluate India's contribution to the liberation of Bangladesh war and what has been its biggest outcome today. The second question: the US-India Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership has the potential to aid sustainable post-pandemic development. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.